Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology, Season 4. I promised you a lot of magical animals today, so there'll be two stories, so buckle up. Yesterday, I sorted through all the challenge comments from day one, and there were a couple of questionable answers, which I mentioned a bit yesterday, and I have one more thought about that I want to share. So we have more than a week of animal stories ahead, and I can see that some people aren't that familiar with a lot of these animals. So I'm going to try and fill in with a tiny bit of natural history and bird terminology as we go. So let's look at a few slides just before we start today. So a blackbird is a fairly small bird with a beautiful musical song. It's really nothing like a crow, or the crow's bigger cousin, the raven. And even crows and ravens, they're quite different. Culturally, people think about a blackbird and a crow very differently. Now, we're going to meet some wild boar today. The native British ones or Irish ones are actually not as big or aggressive as, say, a lot of domestic pig breeds, but they're scary looking, I guess. And males have long been considered a symbol of courage and ferocity. And this is our friend the eagle, again, the golden eagle, huge bird, 2-meter wingspan, 6-foot wingspan, big bird. But in Britain and Ireland, this is what we mean by a hawk, a much smaller bird, which mostly hunts even smaller birds. In casual speech, we might also say a hawk about birds which are technically falcons, like peregrine falcons and merlins and things. But they're all fairly small hunting birds. In North America, at least in the US, hawk has come to mean something else. Quite big birds, like red-tailed hawks, which look a bit more like eagles, although they're not as big. So in Celtic texts, because they come from Europe, think eagle, huge, scary bird, hawk, smaller and weaker bird, but very fast. And trout are a bit smaller than salmon. We're not going to meet any more trout, I don't think, in this series, but people were so confused about the trout and the salmon. Trout are a bit smaller. Salmon migrate, whereas river trout might also migrate, but there are trout in small lochs which don't have a river attached to them or anything. They do find they're quite happy in their enclosed environment. The trout are usually a bit slimmer and they're more speckled, and they don't have that hook on their lower jaw that you see in mature salmon. So the word for trout, brach, is also the word for speckled in Gaelic. That's how we think of them, as the speckled fish. So folk are very aware of the difference, partly because the meat of the two fish is very different, so they wouldn't be interchangeable in people's minds. And we'll also meet an owl today. Now, Britain has a few kinds of owls. It's not 100% clear which kind of owl is in our story. It's probably a barn owl. They also can live in holes in trees and things, not just barns. So let's have a story. Tuain Macarol was the son of the king of the Dal Fiatach of Ulster. Now Saint Finnea paid him a visit because he had heard that Tuain knew the whole history of Ireland, and he requested that Tuain recount it to him. And as we shall see, Tuain had good reason to know Ireland's history well. So 1,002 years after Noah's flood, Agniman, son of Starn, came to Ireland from Greece. 24 couples came in all. And they increased until they were 1,000 people. But then a plague came and wiped them all out in a week. Only one man survived, and that was Tuain. And so he told his story to Saint Finian. He said, I lived like a wild man, in fear of my life because of wolves. Ireland was a wilderness for 32 years, and I became old and feeble. I spent a lot of time hiding in caves, sleeping like an animal. Then finally a ship came. I knew it was my uncle's ship, but I had become wild and unkempt. I was afraid, I was ashamed of my nakedness, so I hid, and I didn't greet them. I slept in my cave, waiting for death. And one night I dreamt that I passed into the shape of a stag, and when I awoke, it was so. I really was young. I was a virile stag, and soon I became the chief of all the stags of Ireland, and I would proudly make my circuit with my followers. Later, Nevid came to Ireland with his people, but the sea was wild and they were unable to make landfall, and so they drowned or starved in great numbers in their ships. I saw all this through the eyes of a stag. And then I began to grow old. I was again pursued by wolves, and I hid in my cave. And then it came to me, as I looked out of the opening of the cave one night, that I knew how to pass into another form. I went into the shape of a wild boar, and again I became the biggest and the boldest, and I was soon the champion and leader of all the boars as I traveled the land. But in time I grew old again. I returned to Ulster, where I had my cave, and at that time Shevin came to Ireland. The Fir Bolg and the Fir Domnan are descended from him. I grew tired and I fasted so that I might change my shape again. After 3 days I had no more strength, and I became a hawk. I was young and carefree, soaring above Ireland, learning of all that was happening. Beoch, son of Jordanen, conquered Ireland at that time, the great progenitor of the Gaels and the Tuatha and the Ande, the tribes of the gods and the not gods, whose origins are so much disputed. I continued for a long time as a hawk, until I had outlived all these new settlers. In time, the sons of Mill took Ireland from the Tuatha by force, and just then my strength was waning and sadness came upon me. I could no longer fly well. I hid in the hollow of a tree above a stream. I fasted for a long time until I awoke as a salmon. God put me in the river, and I knew the greatest joy of any existences then. Swimming as a salmon swims was a wonder. I lived many years escaping from every predator. The nets of men, the claws of hawks, and the spears of fishermen left their scars on me, but I always got away. But I grew old, and life became perilous. It was God who helped me. I was caught in a net and taken to the wife of Carol, the king of this country. I remembered how I was cooked and given to Carol's wife. She was the only one who ate my flesh. And I remember being in her womb and hearing all the conversations in Carol's house as to what was happening throughout Ireland. When the wife of Carol gave birth to me, I grew and I learned quickly. I learned of all that was happening in Ireland, and I became known as a prophet. Then Patrick came, and I was baptized. So you'll notice that at the beginning of the story, Tuin is described as a kind of wise man and historian. And I think that's important to what's going on with these animal stories. I based my version of the story I just told on John Carey's translation in the Celtic Heroic Age, a book I showed you yesterday, and you can read that translation online. I'll share it with you. In his notes, Carey mentions this gloss in the manuscript. Tuin was in Ireland after Fintan for 100 years in the shape of a man. This is what someone has written into the manuscript like later. 20 years in the shape of a pig, 80 years in the shape of a stag, 100 years in the shape of an eagle, 30 years beneath a pool in the shape of a fish, then in the shape of a man again until he grew old, until the time of Finia, that's Saint Finian of the Dalfiatach, the end. So this preoccupation with the ages of animals in the medieval period is really interesting. People still do this a bit. A year to a dog is like 7 years to a human. No, I've got it backwards. A year to a dog is like 7 human years. There we go. But medieval scholars had big ideas about animal ages. So there's another story. I told you we'd have lots of animals today. There's another story, and you may have heard me tell this one before too. I've told it on YouTube and in classes like Shapeshifters and Magical Animals, and the class about Mabon, so lots of you know what's coming now. This story comes from a big, huge, gigantic story from Wales called Culhwch and Olwen, which was actually the subject of season 2 of the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology. And this story is one of the main episodes in Culhwch and Olwen. Culhwch is a young prince who wants to marry a giant's daughter called Olwen. But Olwen's father puts a long list of conditions on the marriage. In order to meet these conditions, several items which are lodged between the ears of this monstrous great boar must be obtained. So boars have lots of bristles here, and these things, a comb and a pair of scissors and a razor, are stuck inside his bristles. So they have to hunt the boar. And that's where Mabon comes in, because he's the only hunter who can manage a special hunting dog called Dridwen, whom they need to hunt. So Mabon is needed to handle the dog to hunt the boar that carries the items that Culhwch needs to give the giant, so he and Olwen can marry. The only problem is that Mabon was stolen from his mother as a 3-day-old infant, and he hasn't been seen since. And it turns out, was a really, really long time ago. Now, Culhwch has a cousin called King Arthur. Maybe you've heard of him. So some of Arthur's crack team of warriors are helping Culhwch with his various quests. And one of them is a chap called Gurhir. And Gurhir has the power to converse with animals. So when they go looking for Mabon, they decide to ask the animals if they know where Mabon is, because apparently there are some really old animals in Wales. I'm going to need a sip of tea for this one. Now, to see where they went, we'll need a map. And this map was hand embroidered by my friend and student Lindsay River, who's letting us borrow it today. And Lindsay, if you're watching this, I hope you'll forgive me, because I've digitally dyed the ocean blue on your beautiful needlework, as it makes it easier for people to know which is land and which is water. So Culhwch's party of helpers set out to seek Mabon, and they first went to the Blackbird of Kilguri. "Do you know where Mabon, son of Modron, is?" they asked, "who was stolen from between his mother and the wall on his 3rd night of life?" And the Blackbird said, "When I first came here, I was just a young bird, and I found a smith's anvil standing unused. No work was done on it, save the work I did, sharpening my beak upon it every evening. I've been here so long that the anvil is worn away to a lump of iron the size of a nut. But I swear that I have heard nothing of the man you seek. Since you are Arthur's messengers, I will take you to an animal older than myself, who may yet have some news of Mabon. Allow me to guide you to him." And the Blackbird led them inland until they met the stag of Hreranvra. "We are messengers from Arthur," said Gurhir. "We know of no animal who is older than you. Do you know anything of Mabon, son of Modron, who has been stolen from her side on his 3rd night of life?" "When I first came here," said the stag, "I only had my small plain antlers of 1 tine. And in this clearing there was a small plain sapling which grew into an oak of 100 great branches. Today there is nothing left of that oak but a red stump. In all this time, from my coming here until today, I have heard nothing of the man you seek, but I myself will guide you, since you came from Arthur, to where you will find an animal who is older than I." He led them northward toward the sea again, until they came to the wood of Cwncawlwyd, the home of an ancient owl. "I have brought messengers from Arthur," said the stag. "Do you know anything of Mabon, son of Modron, taken from his mother's side on his 3rd night of life?" "If I knew this," said the owl, "I would tell you. When I first came here, the great valley you see before you was a wooded glen. A race of men arrived and cut it down. In the time Another wood grew in its place. Again, men came and stripped it away, and in time it grew again. The wood you see before you now is that third growth, and I am so old that my wings are like stumps. Yet in all this time, from youth to old age, I have never heard anything of the one you seek. Still, I would be honored to guide you to the dwelling place of the oldest animal of all, the eagle of Guernabui. They followed the coast until it seemed like they'd reached the very end of the world, and there before them stood a huge eagle. Gurhir spoke, "Great eagle of Guernabui, the messengers of Arthur have come to ask if you know anything of Mabon, son of Modron, who was taken from his mother's side on his third night of life." The eagle of Guernabui spoke to them then, saying, "In times long past, I came to this place. I used to perch on a great stone so tall that from its height I could peck the stars at night. So long have I lived that my claws have worn that stone away to the height of a hand's breadth. Yet from youth to old age, I have not heard anything of the one you speak. But I have a tale to recount. Once upon a time, near the place where the Wye meets the Severn, I flew about Llyn hunting my food, and there I sank my talons into a salmon of great size, thinking I would feast upon it for days. The salmon was strong, and he hauled me down under the water and into the depths, and it was hard for me to escape with my life. I gathered my kindred and went to make war on the salmon of Llyn, intending to destroy him, but he sent messengers to me to sue for peace. And then he asked me to remove the many tridents that fishermen had cast into him, for they troubled him sorely. 10 and 40 tridents I took from his back, and I tell you that unless he knows something of the one you seek, no one does. I will be your guide to his dwelling place." When they arrived at Llyn in the river Severn, the eagle spoke, "Look, noble salmon, I have come to you with messengers from Arthur. Tell us if you have any tidings of Mabon, son of Modron, who was taken from his mother's side on his third night of life." "That which I know I will tell you," replied the salmon. "Every flood tide carries me up the river, where I come to the bend in the wall of Caer Loiu, and there dwells as much grief as I have ever found before. But lest you doubt me, come and ride upon my shoulders, and I will show you." And so, finally, the salmon took them to Mabon, and he was released from his prison, and the hunt could begin. In both of today's stories, which are really quite different, the salmon is the final animal, just as the trout was in our story the first day. Now, my thought is that the trout would have been a salmon in that story if that story had not taken us to an inland loch that has no outlet to the sea. A trout could live there, but a salmon couldn't. I think the trout is a kind of stand-in. But why do you think the salmon always comes last? This is your question for today. Now be careful when you answer this question. There's that thing about correlation and causation. I already know, you don't have to tell me. There are lots of stories about salmon of knowledge. But it isn't enough to tell me that. That's just correlation. I'm asking, why is the salmon the last animal in the story? Maybe it's to do with knowledge. Maybe it's to do with water, or migration, or something else. There's not a perfect answer to this question. But why is the salmon last? Is it making the salmon the most important? Like I say, there's not a perfect answer to this, but try to do some deep thinking about this answer for your challenge question today. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.